right, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Wednesday seminar. I'm sorry I missed last week's seminar, but let everyone know my shoulder is doing well. It's still attached. Hopefully, we'll move as intended. So I'm really delighted today to welcome Jeffrey Rathke, who's the president of the German American Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Prior to joining AGI, he was a senior fellow and deputy director of the Europe program at CSIS, where his work focused on transatlantic relations and U.S. security and defense policy. And he joined CSIS after a 24-year career as a foreign service officer, dedicated primarily to U.S. relations with Europe. He was director of the State Department press office from 2014 to 2015, briefing the State Department press corps and managing the department's engagement with U.S. print and electronic media. He led the political section at the U.S. Embassy in Kuala Lumpur from 2011 to 2014. And prior to that, he was Deputy Chief of Staff to the NATO Secretary General in Brussels, in addition to sort of many other postings. Today, he's going to speak to us on Europe's master of equilibrium and the struggle to shape European security. Jeffrey, welcome to MIT. Delighted to have you.
Good. Thanks so much. Well, that's a very kind introduction, and it's a real privilege to be here and speak with you today. So thank you very much, Professor Fravel, for the invitation, and I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to talk a bit about German security and defense policy, where it's come from, and most importantly, where it's headed and what that might mean for the United States and for Europe over the coming years. So when asked to come up with a title, I think I thought of the principle that has been thrown overboard in Germany's foreign relations in the last few years, and that was equilibrium. Germany was a country centered around minor modifications and tinkering to European, to other international structures, because it was inhabiting an international system that benefited Germany enormously. And so the less change, the better, was the approach. And that has run into a number of problems. The first is the international security environment and dramatic change. Second, changes in the international economy. In particular, the ascent of China up the value chain, which puts a lot of pressure now on Germany's high value added manufacturing sector and foreign investments, as well as demographic and other changes that have left Germany with a much greater set of challenges than they faced 10 years ago. If you look today at Germany's defense spending, just for example, in 2025, Germany will spend about 86 billion euros on defense. Next year, that will increase to 117 billion. And that will amount to about 2.8% of Germany's GDP next year. And that's up from a remarkably low level of 35 billion in 2014. Germany is also on a path. It's projected to reach 162 billion in defense spending annually by 2029, which will represent 3.5% of Germany's GDP. So among European countries, Germany is one of the fastest in its projections for reaching that target. Now, I will caveat, of course, and say spending is not everything, and I think everybody knows that. So I don't want to take that as the sole metric by which to judge what's happening in Germany. But I think it's a pretty dramatic turnaround compared to where the country was just a couple of years ago. And the reasons why are obvious. First, Russian aggression in Europe, and second, uncertainty about the fear of U.S. abandonment, essentially. So what I'd like to talk about today are three things. One, how did we get here? Second, what are the national security and defense tasks that Germany has identified and that it faces? And then the third is, what is the likelihood of success in accomplishing those objectives? And to give a little bit away at the start, I think there is still a lot of muddled thinking in Germany strategically, and so while the renewed sense of purpose and the massive resource commitments are encouraging, they will not be successful without more thoughtful application and prioritization against the strategic tasks and the strategic environment Germany faces. So how did we get here? There have been two pillars of German foreign policy since in the post-war period: European integration and the transatlantic alliance. And so those two have been the fallback for every German initiative since it was reintegrated into the community of nations starting in 1949 with the founding of the Federal Republic. When that is expressed in security terms, Germany has been completely dedicated to NATO. There is no German defense perspective that exists outside of NATO in any meaningful sense. Yes, they participate in multinational force structures. Yes, there is a European security and defense policy in which Germany participates. But for the country's security, that means and has meant NATO for 75 years. And so now we see the challenges that begin, that emerge. Economically, Germany has been a trade-oriented, high-value-added manufacturing location. It has not been successful uniformly throughout all this time. In the early and mid-90s, Germany was the sick man of Europe, and people may remember that there were times when it was plagued by high unemployment, relatively low productivity, and so forth. So there is nothing inevitable about the strength or the weakness of the German economy, but the international orientation of that economy has been a consistent factor. This also goes hand in hand with the push for European integration. In particular, the introduction of the single currency and the single market. That was really the last big institutional thing that Germany played a significant role in, and that was over 30 years ago. Helmut Kohl was, in my view, the last German chancellor to really try to shape European structures and to bring some innovative energy, or at least political commitment, to European reorganization. Since then, there has been relatively little. What flows from that is a diplomatic posture that Germany has also had throughout the post-war period and especially in the post-Cold War period, which has been basically following the US lead on security policy, with some divergences, Iraq War 2003 being the best example, or maybe Libya 2011. But without Germany taking responsibility for any major international security initiatives. And that is how we wound up in 2014 with Germany spending 1.19% of its GDP on defense. Again, that 35 billion euros that I mentioned earlier. The end of Germany's conscription system in 2011, or it was suspended to be more precise. And in a way, the broader sublimation of German national interests in either a European or a transatlantic interest, which has been politically very convenient and successful for managing relations with neighbors, especially neighbors who suffered enormously during the Second World War, but which also tended to obscure for the German public as well as for Germany's leaders what national objectives they were pursuing in the security policy and the foreign policy realm. So what all this comes together to represent is an incrementalism in international affairs, a political economy which has no fixed principles other than the existence of and the flourishing of the single market, an aversion to debt, especially to Europeanized debt. Germany has in its constitution still an anti-deficit provision, which was instituted when Merkel was chancellor. We'll come back to talk about that in a minute. And so all of this meant that most German political energy was spent on maintaining these balances that were so favorable to Germany from about, let's say, 2000, 2002 onwards. And that's where this sort of master of equilibrium, Angela Merkel, really fits into the picture. She embodies, in a way, this German approach, which is shared much more widely than only she herself or her political party. But as someone who served as chancellor for 16 years, she became the arbiter of European consensus, the person who at every European summit was the key voice to point the way toward whatever compromise was going to emerge. And that was all done without any actual ambition for change in Europe that Merkel ever expressed. There was no European innovation that Merkel ever made a personal cause. Instead, her role was to keep the whole thing balanced and moving forward. A vision of Europe as sort of a consensus machine, rather than one that necessarily needs to travel to a particular destination. One digression, those of you who have spent time in Germany, former Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, who towered over Germany's intellectual and political life for many years after his chancellorship ended in 1982, he had a gift for the barbed quip, and he was asked once about vision for I forget exactly whether it's for the country, for Europe, whatever. But his answer was, if you have visions, you need to see a doctor. And this really kind of embodies or it crystallizes the operating principle that defined Germany until probably 2022, and perhaps still does today in some respects. It's risk aversion as a guiding principle of statecraft, and that's part of what I think has gotten Germany into the pickle that it's in now. There have been since 2014 and the first Russian invasion of Ukraine, changes in Germany's trends. First, an increase in defense spending, but that also went hand in hand with a very traditional approach, trying to manage the conflict as one between Russia and Ukraine through the Minsk process, through endless and ultimately unproductive negotiations with Vladimir Putin. So even as Germany was increasing by about 15% after the first Russian invasion, its defense spending, its political operating system had not changed. During the first Trump administration, there was a rhetorical shift from Merkel, who was then in her last term as chancellor, but I would argue no meaningful course correction. And you see this in two ways. One is that although Merkel said that Germany needed to become the days when Germany could rely completely on others were in the past, and that therefore they would need to rely more on themselves. But if you look at the resources devoted to national security priorities, they increased slowly and grudgingly, and never as part of a multi-year approach to Germany's resources. I mentioned the multi-year approach, and we'll come back to it later, but it is an important principle of German budgeting that the government in power usually has a medium-term financial plan which reaches out 4 years. So it includes the budget that is under deliberation and the out years. And so what you saw, that even as Merkel and Germany were talking about the need to do more for their own defense, they had a flat medium-term projection. So what that meant is that every increase was, one, not reliable for any sorts of longer-term procurement or decisions or other initiatives, which hobbled the ability to address the capability deficits and readiness problems of the Bundeswehr. And they were also politically not salient enough for the government that they were broadly socialized and carried, supported by the mainstream parties. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, there's one word which you will always hear if you talk to a German about it, and that word is Zeitenwende, which is sort of like a sea change. And Chancellor Scholz committed through new debt 100 billion euros to redressing the Bundeswehr's clear capability gaps. And he articulated the goal for Germany to have the strongest conventional forces in Europe. But he only said it once. I would point out that was shortly after February 2022 that he identified that as a goal, but then afterwards continued to water that down when he spoke about it at all. The head of Germany's land forces at the time of the Russian invasion said publicly in a statement that shocked everyone who hadn't been paying attention that Germany's armed forces were more or less naked. And this is a phrase that still echoes throughout Germany's security and policy community, as well as through its political class. And so what we see is, I didn't mean to be disparaging about Olaf Scholz, although I did get a chuckle, so that's nice. There are a number of things that the Scholz government took on as new commitments, and the most telling of it was of them, I think, was the decision to permanently deploy a brigade of the Bundeswehr in Lithuania, which crosses all sorts of lines that Germany had previously drawn for themselves. You could argue it's inconsistent with the NATO-Russia Founding Act, leaving aside that the violations of that understanding have been so numerous as to render it kind of irrelevant. But it was still one of the foundational principles of German relations and approach and German policy toward Russia. So Germany has also raised the target at the time for the Bundeswehr to a strength of 203,000, up from 180,000. So a significant increase was made one of their national goals, but relatively little was accomplished in meeting the expansion of the Bundeswehr. So we see sort of a mixed record. On the one hand, expansion of resources in a special fund for procurement, but with a continued flat line of medium-term projections for defense spending. The re-election of Donald Trump and an election in February of 2025, which brought Chancellor Merz to power, I think have erased any question about whether there was a way to muddle through along the lines that Germany had been doing. Friedrich Merz, on the night of the election even, elevated security policy and the relationship with the United States to a top priority when, this was, by the way, a week after Volodymyr Zelensky had been in the White House and gotten a dressing down from Trump and from Vice President Vance. And so Merz made a statement that was strikingly clear and against type. Merz had been a long-standing transatlanticist, headed one of the, after his time in politics, he headed an organization called the Atlantic Brücke, the Atlantic Bridge, which brings together private sector and other individuals who have an interest in the transatlantic relationship and so forth. And Merz said on election night that it would be a top priority, step by step, to achieve independence from the United States. And he even acknowledged that that was an outrageous thing for a CDU, a center-right politician of his vintage and his background to say. But this has set the tone in a way, and certainly the priorities of the German government since that election and since the government took office in the spring of this year. The first thing that they did was to reform their constitutional debt brake in a way that is, well, it exempts from the debt brake any defense spending above 1% of GDP. So it is an open-ended facility for Germany to spend basically unlimited amounts, whatever they can get a parliamentary majority for, without any consideration of the debt consequences. At the same time, though, this was not this only went through because there was also a commitment to create a 500 billion euro fund for infrastructure. This is a way of maintaining political cohesion to pursue some priorities of not only of his coalition partners, the Social Democrats, but also the other mainstream parties in the Bundestag, which had to vote in favor of this constitutional amendment. Now, Germans amend their constitution a lot more frequently than we do in this country, so it's exceptional when it happens, but it's not. But it will happen usually, every couple of years for one thing or another. But in this case, in order to get the mainstream opposition parties on board, there was this commitment as well to new spending on infrastructure, which is, for those of you who've traveled in Germany lately, if you've tried to take a train or anything else, you may have noticed that their infrastructure has been crumbling and suffered from underinvestment for a long time. So debt brake reform changes the game on the one hand because it eliminated a constraint that had always prevented governments from not only from spending in the moment, but from planning for future procurements. And as we've seen since then, Germany is now on a trajectory that where the parliamentary approved financial plans envision a rapid increase in resources for defense. There are some particular aspects of it, but we'll maybe come back to those a bit more later, such as a commitment to spend 35 billion on space defense capabilities, which is space is an area where Germany has significant technological capacity, but space-related defense issues have not been a priority. So 35 billion over the next 5 years is just one example. The other institutional innovation, and this gets to more of the strategic thinking that goes into German policy, was the creation of a National Security Council. Now, those of you who've spent time in Washington and worked in or close to the United States government, you might wonder whether the National Security Council is the best model for organizing complex international security policy deliberation and execution. But Germany had suffered for a long time from the problem of ministerial sovereignty, essentially, and a weak constitution for the chancellor's ability to impose decisions on cabinet ministers. So, in practical terms, what this means is the chancellor can't tell the foreign minister what to do, especially when the foreign minister might come from a coalition party. Excuse me. And so this ministerial principle had always been hotly contested and vigorously defended, and it meant that there was always a significant degree of political friction in German foreign policy making and also in security and defense policy. So by creating a body which exists in the chancellor's office that has the function of and is called the National Security Council, the idea was that this would streamline the rapid surfacing of important issues, the coordination of ministerial actions to address them, and also to provide an element of strategic foresight, which Germany had been lacking. We've published a longer piece on this at AGI, which I would encourage anyone who's interested in this to read. It's written by Phyllis Berry, formerly National Intelligence Officer for Europe at the National Intelligence Council. So I won't go into too many of the details, but I would simply sum it up by saying that this first step is a small step because its structure, its staffing, and the seniority of its leadership do not convey a new priority for the chancellor to exert greater direct control over foreign and security policy. But we can discuss that more if that's of interest. So I think, Germans, as perhaps other places too, fall victim to the equating of euro amounts spent on defense or appropriated for defense and strategic action. And while the country is on a path to spend a level of its GDP on defense that it has not spent since the late 60s, there is not as much strategic thinking and public deliberation going on about what exactly Germany is preparing for. And so that's what I'd like to talk about for a minute here. It's clear, I think, to everyone in Germany that their biggest threat is Russia, although they do face other threats, certainly, including a threat that is less military, but certainly security and political from China. But there are questions about to what degree Germany can and should rely on the United States to play what kind of a role in European security for the foreseeable future. There is relatively little discussion of what the alternatives and what the European mechanisms should be that would allow Germany to pursue its security most effectively along with its neighbors. There is little discussion of the capabilities, the military capabilities that Germany needs to execute whatever strategy it has. And instead, there is a fixation on the amount that is being spent. So, the weakness that Germany has had to struggle with for decades has not just been a resource one. That's simply the most visible aspect of it, but also an intellectual and a political underinvestment in national strategy. To go through that sort of hierarchy quickly, as far as the tasks, what is Germany trying to, what does it have to be prepared to defend itself against? There, I think actually they've done a reasonably good job. I think the public aspect of the government's communication and its framing of the national security challenges has been pretty good. There is a defense minister who's been in office for about 3 years who is actually Germany's most popular politician, which is kind of a remarkable thing. His name is Boris Pistorius from the Social Democratic Party. And he and the chancellor, as well as other political leaders, have talked about this in increasingly clear terms. The defense minister has said on multiple occasions that Germany needs to be prepared for the possibility of a Russian attack on a NATO member state within 5 years. He said that in 2024. So we're really talking about 2029 when we take his statement. Germany's intelligence community has also taken on a greater and a more public role in explaining the threats the country faces, and all of these have been widely accepted. Despite Germany's somewhat fractious political system, the rise of the far right and so forth, which we can talk about more later if folks are interested. But in general, this is broadly accepted in the public. And so that then comes to the question of what is the right structure for Germany to advance its security and European or indeed transatlantic security. Where the country's policy has basically settled under this government, without quite articulating it in these terms, is to, because there's no alternative in the short term to relying on the United States for conventional as well as nuclear deterrence in Europe, then the effort is to sustain American engagement for as long as possible, and to try to get from the United States transparency about the changes that may happen to U.S. Posture in Europe, and U.S. defense commitment to Europe, with enough warning that they can try to adapt, even if it's impossible to replace all of the capabilities that the United States provides for European security. Now, the Trump administration has made, I would say, generally positive noises about this, but I think without a level of detail, and especially without knowing where the U.S. national security strategy, national defense strategy, as well as the force posture review are going to land, there is a lot of anxiety, I would say, about what decisions may come from Washington, how quickly they might be rolled out, whether they would be consulted, and if not, what sort of problems may they have to confront. The fact that just this morning, news reports indicate that the United States and Russia are working once again toward a 28-point peace plan for Ukraine, in which neither the Ukrainians nor the other Europeans have been involved, is just another reason why there is this anxiety across Europe and including in Germany about whether the United States will spring decisions on them that have fundamental consequences for their security. So while Germany continues on a path of trying to keep the U.S. engaged, including through making their own resource commitments that have made an impression on President Trump, I think it's fair to say, Germany has also been building plurilateral mechanisms with its European partners. There's the E3 with France and the UK. There's the E5, which also brings in Poland and Italy, which meet, of course, without US participation, and also a strengthened engagement with Germany's Nordic neighbors. So all of these are a start to creating political mechanisms that can be drawn on to address particular concerns, but they have not evolved into a mechanism that is really reliable and fit for purpose, if part of that purpose is to compensate for diminished US commitment. And here Germany's history and its foreign policy come center stage. Some of you may be familiar with the statement from then Polish Defense Minister Rathke, who said he fears German inaction more than he fears German power. That was a statement he made well over a decade ago. But it gets at a convenient excuse that Germans have had for a long time about getting involved in trying to play a leadership role on security in Europe, and that is Germany's history. It was relatively easy for Germans to say that, well, we could or we would like to, but our neighbors wouldn't understand. Our neighbors wouldn't accept that. I think that was always a view that prevailed much more in Germany than it did in any of Germany's neighbors. I think that excuse has lost so much credibility that it's no longer part of Germany's national debate. Instead, I think there is a need for Germany to shore up and build stronger European relations when it comes to security, in particular that Germany is not going to steamroll. It's through its size, its resources, its procurement decisions, that it is going to make decisions without the input of its neighbors. This is still a quite sensitive issue with Poland, for example, which has decided several years ago to pursue other avenues of procurement, including for its main battle tank, which it's bought from South Korea, and that they explicitly rejected the German option, even though Poland has quite a few Leopard tanks in their inventory. In fact, at one point they had more active Leopard tanks than Germany did. So the risk at this point is the massive resource imbalance that is coming online at the same time that Germany has underinvested in its political relationships to build consensus and to keep a cohesion among its European allies. Again, Chancellor Merz is investing in these relationships, as is his government, but there is a lot more to do. So what I think is also missing from all of these plurilateral and bilateral initiatives that have been happening for the last half year, more intensively. I mean, they existed before Merz took office in most cases, is the guiding purpose that Merz articulated on election night, but that has no longer been the explanation to European publics for why it is they are having to undergo such dramatic shifts in their priorities and in their spending. When we come back to the U.S. commitment to Europe, I would say only that even after the publication of the U.S. strategic documents and the conclusion of the forced posture review, there is a doubt in Germany whether an increasingly personalist system in the Trump administration means you can take much guidance and perhaps comfort from decisions from strategic documents such as the NSS or the NDS. But in any case, the trend is pretty clear toward less U.S. engagement and less U.S. security commitment to Europe. So here we have another problem that is not really being discussed much in Europe and certainly not in Germany, and that is the resource commitments and the capability targets that NATO has set are based around a model in which the United States is part of the conventional and, if necessary, nuclear response to Russian aggression. And so a change in U.S. posture in Europe would necessarily change the requirements from Europeans, and it might invalidate frankly, the entire defense planning process that NATO has been painstakingly developing over the last few years. So can critical U.S. enablers be replaced? Can they be or at least can the risks be mitigated? And does it make sense for Germany to continue simply fulfilling capability targets that might have less relation to the overall European defense needs if they have to fight the same enemy in a different way with less U.S. engagement? So to come to the last part of my reflections, I would highlight a few areas where you see some grounds for cautious optimism, and areas where the goals have been identified, or at least the issue has been identified, but without adequate progress. So if you think about some of the capabilities that Germany relies on, I mentioned space earlier, where the country is ready to make a massive investment in space defense. But you also have critical shortfalls in air-to-air refueling, in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Again, the space element may help take care of some of that. In air and missile defense. And offensively on precision deep strike. And I'll focus on the last two of those. Germany has ushered in two initiatives over the last couple of years to try to begin addressing these. The first was what was called the European Sky Shield Initiative. This was announced at the time of the 2024 NATO summit in Washington, and but it is basically a procurement consortium. It is an invitation to countries to join and perhaps lower unit costs by procuring together the short, medium, and longer range air defense and missile defense assets that they so sorely lack. But this is an initiative you hear very little about lately. Germany also has a national approach, which is disconnected to some degree from that of its European partners, because it also has a long-range missile defense component to the U.S.-Israeli Arrow 3 system, which is as much a political initiative as it is a defense initiative. We can talk more about that if that's of interest. But you see major commitments of billions of euros that have been only partially coordinated with European partners, and that have not yet achieved much beyond countries signing on to a declaration of intent, and without much happening in the way of procurement yet. And then long-range strike. This is another one of the areas. This was announced in summer 2024 that there would be a European long-range strike approach, which would include several leading countries, including France, in developing a long-range strike capability, which would help to hold at risk, in the event of a conflict, assets deep in Russian territory. Promises that a model would be agreed and announced by the end of that year were never realized, and there has been only partial progress throughout this year. So there is the risk of a splashy announcement not being followed up by the kind of political work to bring key countries on board with the necessary resources, and then to initiate a development process that will yield in some near term a usable asset. The cautionary tale for that many have in mind is the Future Combat Air System, which is a German, French, Spanish initiative where recriminations and mistrust between Germany and France, especially for many years, have been undermining the legislative commitment to pour massive resources into a system that would be fielded at the earliest in 2040. So you have this problem of the disconnect of the politically relevant timelines and the urgency of the threat that Germany perceives with the timelines for developing and delivering. And so the reaction increasingly from is one of frustration, including in Germany, not only because they look at the French political calendar the same way everybody else does and sees an presidential election happening in 2027, but also because they feel it is too long, not going to yield something they need at the time they need it. And so you could have some of these flagship multinational cooperation projects either being watered down, if not abandoned altogether. So those are just a few of the issues that are out there. I don't want to talk more than this now. I'd rather hear reactions and take the conversation in whatever direction you all would like. But thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you. So please raise your hands to get on the list. First, I see Daniel. So Daniel, over to you, and then everyone else.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm interested in the budget process. So I understand that Germany had to change parts of its constitution to allow it to set certain debt limits. I think last month there was also a release from the EU spending limits as well. So I'm just curious about the sustainability of spending. You mentioned how much Germany's borrowing to increase the spending. My understanding is that there's lots of concern among EU members that, great, we'll have debt financing for now, but who knows how long it's going to last. So I'm just curious about how your perspective on the German public's willingness to keep borrowing, politicians' willingness to keep borrowing, and then how that actually affects long-term spending in defense goals over time. It's actually sustainable or not.
Yeah. So can slice this in a couple of different ways. The first one, in terms of public debt in Germany, it is around 60% of GDP. So they've got quite a lot of headroom relative to pretty much any other major European country. France is above 100%, Italy around there as well. So their fiscal and debt capacity is not really in question. And so in that sense, it's sustainable. And if you take the amounts that they're committed to spending or the amounts that they would have to borrow, one estimate I heard said that it might take them to 70% of GDP. So it's a significant amount of money, but still, relatively close to the EU target, and everybody else is missing the EU target anyway. So, it's hard to imagine a scenario where Germany gets taken to task when others are in so much more egregious violation of those debt rules. The other question is the political, and then there's a public dimension to this. Politically, I think for the remainder of this legislative term, the coalition government will remain committed to making investments in Germany's defense. I didn't mention it, but one important development recently is agreement on a law that would change the military service system in Germany. It wouldn't bring back conscription, but it edges in that direction. Essentially, it would require all men reaching age 18 and would notify all women, but women are not. You would need a constitutional amendment to include women in this mustering process. Anyway, to provide information, to be called up for mustering, and then to have the opportunity to voluntarily serve. So there's not an obligatory element to it yet, but in line with the NATO force goals that are now in place, the expansion of the Bundeswehr to 203,000 is now off the table. The target is 260,000. So we're talking about increasing by 80,000 the size of a military force, which right now is 180. And also Germany is committed to creating a reserve that would be 200,000. So total force available 460,000, reserves plus active duty. And so this new military service model is part of that. And that has pretty broad public support. People age 16 to 24 don't think so highly of it, but in political terms, it's probably sustainable in public opinion terms. The other question, though, is what happens to inflation and Germany's economy, especially if there is a sense that increased borrowing is fueling inflation. We've seen it in this country. Inflation is, it becomes almost a irresistible political force once it is anchored in the minds of people. In Germany, it's even more the case. I would say the level of and it's part of the country's kind of budgetary fiscal conservatism is this fear of inflation. So that I think is a variable or a wild card that could affect the broad political and public consensus around massive reinvestment in Germany's defense capabilities. And that'll be the thing to watch, I think.
Julia.
Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to get back to the question of the efforts undertaken by the German government right now to build up the manpower capacity in the military. And you mentioned that the public generally has come around to accept the state's national security objectives and Russia as an aggressor, but potentially the 18 to 24-year-olds in the country have not. So I guess, what, from your perspective, should the German government be doing to increase the salience of the urgency of the moment, the youth population in particular, and essentially start to kind of prepare the population for the potential to have to implement conscription?
Mm-hmm. Right, and so this fight about whether conscription should be reinstituted. I mean, Chancellor Merz's party is in favor of reinstituting conscription. You can't get a 2/3 majority in the current Bundestag to reinstate, and especially the question of how you would deal with women. Would it only be for men, and so forth? So politically, it was impossible to revert to that model. But they have done a few things to try to increase the visibility of the armed forces in public life. It was 2 defense ministers ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, just as an example, people who are in uniform, Bundeswehr service members in uniform, ride public transportation for free, including trains. Now, again, those trains might be late and maybe they're grumbling on the platform with everybody else. But nevertheless, it was an unusual step at the time. But it fits more broadly in this effort to remind Germans that the people serving in the Bundeswehr are an important part of their society, and that they have, and that it's to raise the status essentially of military service, which had fallen quite low in the period from, in the post-Cold War period. Keep in mind, Germany had a huge standing army in the Cold War. And it was a natural thing. There was conscription. And so even if people didn't love their experience, and many people took civil service opportunities, there was a broader understanding, which then really atrophied. In the current effort to increase recruitment, they have stressed a few things. One, many of you have lived in Europe, or any Europeans here, costs a lot of money to get a driver's license. You've got to take a long course, costs you thousands and thousands of euros to get a driver's license. Well, now this will be included as part of your military service. And so there are some other ways in focusing more clearly on future professional benefits, either learning skills that would be equivalent to an apprenticeship program that you might do in the private sector. They're trying to find ways to infuse these sorts of incentives into the system. The way the United States does this, of course, one of the major ways is through funding higher education after you've been in military service. But since that's free in Germany, that's not something you can really, employ as an attractive component.
They get driving tanks down the Champs-Élysées.
Maybe Constitution Avenue at the parade next July 4th. So they might tear up the asphalt a little less than in Abrams. I don't know. So this is something that they recognize, and within their own social safety network, they're trying to find ways to employ those as well. But I mean, I think there are a lot of people who assume this initiative it has to be tried to do this voluntarily, and that it probably will fail. But so that's sort of where they are now.
Great. Austin.
Thanks very much. I get to ask a bunch of questions. I will restrict myself to one and maybe a half.
Okay.
Stay below the two threshold.
1.5.
So the first is, you mentioned nuclear deterrence a couple of times. Could you sort of reflect on the sort of where the German discourse on this is, and particularly how credible U.S. extended deterrence is in light of potential conventional force posture reductions? Is there a floor below which it just is wholly incredible in terms of force posture? The half question is just the last white paper from the Ministry of Defense I'm aware of is 2016. Is that still the case? And if so, are they working on a new one? Because that one was for a whole different kettle of fish. Thanks.
Right. So I'll take the second one first, or the half one first. There have been a number of policy documents that have been layered on top of that white paper, and there is a national security strategy which the government has to release. And so any Ministry of Defense product is going to come after that. I don't believe it's been initiated yet. I'm not aware of a target date. It could be that I've overlooked something, but it will come, but it will come later. Nuclear deterrence. Well, after, from a point in 2011, when the government that took office in 2011 talked about removing U.S. Nuclear weapons from Europe. And so Germans love nuclear deterrence now. They love extended deterrence, and because they worry about what may happen to it. So the as a mobilizing factor in the German public, anti-nuke sentiment is not particularly significant at the moment. There are still some political figures who call for it, but that's not where the center of gravity is. So in that sense, and I think that's also one of the other steps that Olaf Scholz took as chancellor February 2022 was to announce that Germany, instead of procuring F-18s, would buy F-35s to fulfill their part of NATO's nuclear sharing commitments. And there's even talk now about perhaps acquiring more than the 35 F-35s that they had committed to buy then. So in that sense, Germany is, wants to be seen keeping itself at the leading technological edge as a way of demonstrating their commitment to NATO's nuclear policy, and hopefully keeping the United States engaged. But there's a deeper part of your question, and I think it's the most interesting part of your question is, what are the weapons that the United States has in Europe as part of as the physical manifestation of the extended deterrent in Europe now? The B-61 bomb. To what degree is that appropriate for the threat that that Germany and the rest of Europe faces. There are questions about that, but I have to say it is not gripped. It is not steering the discussion. That's not where the thrust of German strategic thinking is on these issues. I think it's particularly pertinent, but I don't think you've got the right political circumstances to have a thoughtful and effective debate within NATO about whether the US nuclear weapons presence in Europe should change in some way and what that might look like. I think it's just too unpredictable what would come of that. I see two fingers there.
Oh, so Vipin had two fingers as well.
Oh, yeah? Okay.
Okay, Barry.
Age before Gabe.
This is kind of a subtle question on the nuclear question, which is the question of salience. Back in Cold War days, Europeans liked the idea that the Soviets would believe that at some point nuclear escalation was inevitable. So get them to buy 30 days worth of ammo, 45 days worth of ammo, but you're going to, in principle, you're going to fall off a cliff. It wouldn't really work that way, but you wanted to convey that, and you wanted to convey the idea that, if this thing goes on for very long, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
As I read the debate now, there seems to be a subtle difference, which is nuclear escalation might happen. We would prefer, if we have to have a war with the Russians, that it not be nuclear. Nuclear weapons went back to the shelf. We are now loading more and more at the front of the shelf. That's my perception. Maybe it's just a fever dream that I have, but I just wonder what you think about that observation.
I mean, I think you're right. And there's been basically an inversion of the Cold War situation where the Warsaw Pact was conventionally superior to NATO forces, and therefore we had a reliance on nuclear weapons for the in the plans for the defense of Europe, which is different than it needs to be now. So in that sense, I think there's much, well, I think if there is a desire to avoid any conflict becoming nuclear, and that I think is also part of the political view of this government and even the previous government, that they need to increase their stockpiles. They need to learn from Ukraine's experience, even if they're not going to have to fight the same war Ukraine has had to fight, but that is their, the expansion of industrial capacity, the ability to ramp it up when needed, and to have sufficient stockpiles to fight a conventional war so that a nuclear war doesn't have to be contemplated. Yeah, I think that's the way they look at it. And yeah, it is a change.
Thank you for an interesting great talk. I was going to follow up on Austin's question in a little different way. And I'll come back at lunch. I'll come back to the B-61 discussion.
Yeah,
a lot of thoughts about that. But I wanted to ask sort of the German view, or your perception of the German view of the Northwood Declaration. So in a world in which, I mean, the UK and France, as Europe's other nuclear powers, are signaling that they may sort of more robustly complement, rather than, I don't think substitute is sort of the right word, U.S. extended nuclear deterrence in Europe. How does Germany view that? How credible are some of the movements towards better coordination between the UK and France? And to what extent can it offset concerns about the reliability or credibility of U.S. extended nuclear deterrence, particularly the French? I mean, just because of their DNA, in terms of the European dimension and sitting outside of NATO and the NPG, et cetera, et cetera. There were, I know, bilateral discussions that were public between Germany and France on this question about a sort of greater French contribution. How do the Germans think about that credibility? What do they want? What can they get?
Yeah. So I think in general, Chancellor Merz has considered it a priority to rebuild relations with France that had really deteriorated between Olaf Scholz and Emmanuel Macron. And this is one element of it, is discussing the ways in which France's approach to nuclear deterrence and their role and France's role might change. So in that regard, the German government is quite happy to see an intensified UK-France discussion, and to also even be part of discussions with them at the appropriate time. The I would say misgiving that I hear from Germans has a lot to do, again, with the French electoral calendar, because they know that the Rassemblement National is adamantly opposed to any kind of a role for French nuclear forces beyond national tasks. And so, so there is concern about moving too far down a path now that might turn out to be a dead end. That's not to say they won't discuss, but I think there's probably not going to be a rush, would be my prediction, on the German side to accomplish something very quickly. There's also, and I mean, you know this 100 times better than I do, so I would rather turn the question around to you. But my impression is that there's not really that. You said, was it to complement rather than replace? I think that's probably the best that you'd be able to get from those countries in nuclear deterrence terms. And I think, there has been from time to time a flare up in Germany of people saying, well, gee, maybe we need our own nuclear weapons, which nobody in any position of responsibility takes seriously. But they are views that naturally bubble up because they scratch their heads and look at this. Well, if the United States is not going to be there for us, and we don't think the French and the Brits can handle it themselves, what are the other options? I mean, so it's predictable that this comes up, but thus far it has not gotten any traction with anybody who is in power or near to it, that in order to influence it, because it would undermine the entire basis of the treaty on the reunification of Germany, which included Germany's commitment to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and a whole bunch of other international commitments. So it's a non-starter, but it's still titillating from time to time for people to throw that out in public.
Florian, is that your two? Is this a two finger, or is this your one finger?
I have both. I have a nuclear two finger, on the industrial base one finger.
You're allowed
Okay.
one. You're allowed one question. Choose wisely.
Okay. So I will ask the industrial one. Sorry for the nuclear perspective. Asking about the fact that I wouldn't ask if France nuclear doctrine is a real limit for the German to have a better integration. I will not ask these questions, but I would rather ask this one. So you speak about the SCAF, and that's no problem. But we does have the MGCS and the high metal problem.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
When states claim to have the same political view, all that, in your opinions, how do they enforce their will to private companies like Rheinmetall or that?
So I want to make sure I respond to your question. Is your question about whether? By the way, you're right. Of course, there is also this other big multinational or bilateral, the main ground combat system. But is your question about the government's role or about the industry's role?
It's more about the government, like how to enforce the political will
Yeah.
to industrial base when it's private company.
He wants
Yeah.
to nationalize.
Right. Well.
That's been nationalized a long time ago, but that's
Okay.
my opinion.
Right. Well, I think that's one of the issues that's at the heart of this disagreement. I mean, it's also, for a long time, Germany's checkbook diplomacy approach was mostly, it was not primarily a military or a defense principle. But at a time when Germany is getting away from checkbook diplomacy, they realize they, of course, are the largest contributor to the EU budget, the largest economy in Europe, et cetera, et cetera. So therefore, they have to pay their share. But I think they see the downsides of German disengagement and trying to solve problems with money. And so in those circumstances, then to have a situation with these two big projects where, at least from the point of German legislators, they question whether the value, whether this is essentially, Germany subsidizing the French aircraft and aerospace industry, and they doubt whether the product will be, again, timely and effective. So they've thrown a lot of money, but they have to throw a lot more money at this over the next 15 years. And so it just seems to me, without being an expert on the components or the requirements or any of those things, but it just seems to me that politically this is becoming an increasingly difficult thing to sustain when Germany is having to mobilize massive amounts of money to meet a threat that they see in the next 5 years. And if you don't meet that threat that you've got in the next 5 years, it doesn't matter what you're doing for the 15-year and beyond threat. So there's a political dynamic at work which is causing people in the German system to question whether these massive multinational projects are a good way of addressing these concerns, which has of course has a much bigger implication across Europe, because there is this, what I consider a chimera, this idea that if only Europeans would just consolidate all of their purchases, they could lower unit costs and they could get a massive value increase for the same amount of money. I just don't see how, in a Europe of nation states, that is really going to work. There may be some improvements you could make for international coordination and multinational procurement, certainly, but as a solution, I think that falls short.
Jemima.
Hi, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. So just continuing on the defence industry theme, my understanding was that one of the factors that precipitated Poland from moving from Germany to South Europe for arms procurement was the fact that it could get what it wanted faster and more cheaply. And one of the reasons that South Korea was able to facilitate that was that it's leveraged a lot of its civilian industrial capabilities and actual to make its defence industry more efficient. So my question therefore is, given the conventional capability shortfalls in Europe that could be exacerbated by a US withdrawal, and also Germany's ongoing industrial decline, what prevents Germany from undertaking a similar shift to both manufacture much needed parts of Europe and also at the same time revitalise its industry?
Well, nothing is the short answer. And you're right also in your characterization of the Polish decision, which wasn't, a purely political bilateral one. It had a lot to do with the fact that South Korea was able to deliver what they wanted quickly, and that that Germany was unable to produce or to make that the German industry was unable to make commitments to expand production quickly enough to meet what Poland wanted. So yeah, I think there is a difference in scope of the industries in Germany that are suffering or where decline is a threat. automotive, for example. The contribution to Germany's GDP and its employment of the auto sector and its suppliers, it goes well beyond anything that an expanded German defense sector could balance out. So there is certainly opportunity through through orders which are already increasing from the German government to its own defense industry, as well as other opportunities Europe-wide. But I think German political leaders have been careful not to characterize this as something that is going to save the country's bacon, so to speak, because now they'll be making cruise missiles and tanks and armored fighting vehicles and whatever else, maybe aircraft that then can be exported. So I think they've been reluctant to make a promise like that or to characterize it in those terms because they realize that it would ultimately wind up being a disappointment and then could become a political liability if you make a promise like that you can't keep. There's also, just in terms of, this is another one part of the future combat air system problem. Germany's arms export laws and regulation also make they represent an impediment, an obstacle that is significant, and one that has caused also problems for bilateral and multilateral production efforts, because if you can't get a commitment that you'll be willing to sell this to a fixed set of countries, it's hard to make the investments necessary from both sides. So
I'm going to group a couple questions now.
Sure.
Just as we're coming up on time. So first group, and then turn it back to you, will be Caitlin and Jim.
Sure, thanks for a great talk. I want to ask you a question that you should feel free to tell me is completely nutty. So I heard you contrasting the incrementalism of the past with what Germany is doing now and kind of disrupting the equilibrium, but also heard you say that their goal is to make the Bundeswehr by 2031 slightly larger than the US Marine Corps. At the same time that they're talking about a Russian threat to NATO before then. And so I guess in thinking about Germany's security options, it's preferred to hug the United States. It's talking about independence, but not really, in my opinion, doing the things that are commensurate with the scale of the problem it's outlining. There is a third option, which is being no, not that option. I would put that in, and there's a bunch of problems with independence, a bunch of constraints, and you've very usefully outlined those. But there's another one, which is neutrality, right? And that actually was something that we worried about in the Cold War, was, not so much defection, but just the Germans sort of saying, we're not going to do this anymore. We're going to be neutral. Is that nutty to be thinking about that as something that they might do?
We're grouping. Hold that thought. Is it nutty, though? That'll be reverberating. And then Jim.
Yes, enjoyed the talk. Thanks so much. My question is about whether there's a tension or just an actual contradiction between our vision of allies when we talk about extended security, right? That there's sensitive things we do, they're nervous. Extended deterrence is inherently incredible. We have to work really hard to maintain it. Bad things could happen. And then the story you tell about how they're behaving today. Like, they're not highly sensitive, overreacting. You could say they're underreacting to the events around them. Vance goes to Munich, says a lot of crazy stuff. Trump is back. He's never liked NATO. I mean, what you could say, my God, what does it take to get you guys to do something? And, not you, but the Germans to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a tale of underreaction, not a tale of hypersensitivity. Right?
Yeah.
We got a war, and we got a U.S. president who is constantly attacking the alliance. What more do you need to be motivated? When the story I'm hearing is they're doing some, they don't seem very happy.
Okay, so is it nutty? Whether it's nutty or not, I think there is no, aside from the far right and the far left, which together make up less than a third of the seats in the Bundestag. And they don't agree on things, so to group them together is an oversimplification. Neutrality is not on anybody's minds. So in that sense, that's not something that I see on the horizon. But of course, it's an option. But I think the reason it's not a viable one is people have seen for the last 3.5 years what neutrality could lead to. So there's this, there's an unwillingness, at least in security terms, to let themselves be pushed around by the Russians, whether they are willing, and maybe this is the transition point to the other question, whether there's a willingness to draw all of the lessons that you might draw from that, which is really about not only about how you deter Russia from attacking a NATO member state, but how do you also credibly shape the foreign policy actions of Germany's international competitors or adversaries, China, for example, or the United States, if you wanted to put it in those terms. And that's where I think Europe's vulnerability. I think this is a European problem, not a German problem. Germany is maybe the strongest example of it, but it's a broader issue. What you see is the vulnerability of Europeans to all of the choke points, whether those are American choke points, Chinese choke points, ability to cause them pain and discomfort, for which they haven't yet developed or begun to use the instruments that they need. Whether it's an overreaction or an underreaction. So I think what you see happening is not just the reinvestment in military capabilities, again on the part of Germany. I think they're at a point where, like, even if they spent twice as much money, and as at the rate they're doing it now, I don't think they would get appreciably better results for it. So I think, whether that's an underreaction, I think they are at, aside from being on a wartime footing, which they aren't, I think their ability to fix these problems in a period faster than 5 to 10 years is simply hard to do and hard to imagine. I think there's also an aspect of this, which is, the overreaction, underreaction. I think there's something that, from an American perspective, we've always gotten from our security leadership, and that is deference in a wide variety of important areas, and we're getting it now. I mean, if you look at the way that Europe's trade negotiators described their acceptance of the Trump administration's imposition of tariffs, you hear this across the political spectrum. It's because they were worried about Ukraine and about American security abandonment. So this kind of horizontal connection is one that they are extremely worried about. I think the risk to American policymakers is that they will learn these lessons, and sooner or later they're going to fix these vulnerabilities to at least some aspects of American action and other international action, and so our assumption of deference on the part of our European allies is going to become a lot more questionable.
Great. Well, we're at time. This has been a terrific discussion. Thanks so much for helping educate us about Germany, and
I think y'all have educated me as well. So, but thank you
but
so much.
really was terrific. Thank you very much.
Thank you.